The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Ann Snyder is a writer and convener committed to exploring questions of class and culture, moral beauty, and a beatitudinal faith. She is the editor-in-chief of Comment Magazine, which is a publication of Cardus, a think tank devoted to renewing North American social architecture. She's a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. She directs the Philanthropy Roundtable's Character Initiative, and she's a fellow at the Center for Opportunity Urbanism, a Houston-based think tank that explores how cities can drive opportunity for the bulk of their citizens. So many think tanks. Ann Snyder has a lot of irons in the fire, so I was especially grateful that she agreed to be a guest on the Habit Podcast. Ann Snyder, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So you are the editor-in-chief of Comment Magazine, which is part of the, what do you call Cardus? Is it a think tank? Is it a... What?
Yep, a think tank in Canada, yes.
Yeah, right. And so I just wanted to sort of start with some of the things that you say in the manifesto of your magazine. Well, one thing you say is that you're not another worldview magazine. What do you mean by that?
Well, I should first caveat by saying I did not write this manifesto, although when I was thinking about stewarding this next chapter of the magazine's life, I read it. Predecessor, Jamie Smith, I think, had quite a hand in penning that. And I said, oh, this is the right place for me. So I identify with it, but I can't say I'm the original brain.
I guess I meant you as the plural. Yeah. I should have said y'all.
Yeah. No, that's great. So that's a good question. Why do we say we're not another? I think probably because we try to have such a public facing for the common good emphasis. So our tagline is public theology for the common good. Mm-hmm. But there's a fine line, I think. I mean, we would definitely commission essays to voices that would try to bring a quote unquote like biblical worldview to something in the sciences or this great crevice in our cultural moment but I think that language, well, to me, I hear that language and it sounds quite evangelical, and Comment's a little bit more of a deeply ecumenical magazine. It has sort of reformed roots. But I think our general posture is, how do we try to equip those who are often in positions of institutional leadership, but not always? How do we equip those who think in terms of their civic roles? Most of us have many of them. You know, wives, neighbors. We manage people, we serve people, volunteers, etc. How do we think about what of the Christian faith in particular lends wisdom to really serving the common good as best we can? So I think we begin more from a sociological place, and then we sort of are running from this assumption that, as people of faith, we are meant to care for this world in which we live. And we don't want to draw necessarily really sharp lines between secular and sacred. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but it's partly probably we feel maybe that language, the worldview language, is a little like 20th century and sets up some us versus them, just even in sort of unconscious as people hear it. So I think we just try to.
Yeah. Well, one thing you say, the organization says in that manifesto is we believe in institutions, which is kind of an unstylish thing, right? Tell me about that. You believe in institutions.
Yeah, it is unstylish, I think, especially for like millennials and younger, but probably for anyone like who's lived in the West since the 60s, it's a little unstylish. So a few different things. I mean, the word institution is thrown around. It's one of those words that's thrown around so often, and I think a lot of the time it's not clearly defined because it can mean multiple things. I think first of all, when we say that, when Comment Magazine says that, we're sort of trying to suggest a posture that is a little bit skeptical of kind of this notion of a self-made person, and to some degree skeptical of things like finding your true self without help from the outside. We tend to be suspicious of individualism. And we're also kind of skeptical of the latest sort of trend out there culturally, psychologically. That's not to say we don't want to respect and hear and give voice to, but I think there's something about the durability of what an institution is across generations that we really want to honor. And then I think there's, and this is not at all unique to us. I think we bring an interesting theological flavor to what another like sibling publication like National Affairs, which Yuval Levin runs, and he's done a lot of work thinking around institutions and what are they and how have they shifted in terms of the public's view of them over the years. But we're kind of trying to inhabit that middle voice and middle space between sort of policy and kind of government questions and the individual. And that's this very rich territory of family and religion and commerce and the arts and the sciences and neighborliness and place. And so anyways, I guess first of all, it's a posture and like real attentiveness to that middle space, which very rarely seems to get covered in our, mainstream media landscape. And it's just to say, I think when you think of an institution at its best, they are meant to be formative, which means they're kind of normative. Like they should be oriented. This is a fancy word, but toward a telos, like an end that they can name. And there's sort of a moral nature to the way in which, whether we know it or not, we're like likely being shaped by the institutions that we're a part of. And it's not purely contractual, like the rules of a journalistic profession, for instance, which is sort of where I come from. They're not just like mere traffic regulations. They're kind of deeply woven into the practices and behaviors and sensibilities of the people who practice them. And like a teacher's relationship to the craft of teaching, or an athlete's relationship to her sport, or a farmer's relationship to his land is just like not an individual choice that can be easily reversed when certain kinds of like psychic losses exceed psychic profits. So anyways, it's kind of trying to lend a bit more of a covenantal sense that's transgenerational. And I guess the final thing I'll just say is, and I debate this a lot in my own work. I study communities a lot and institutions. And sometimes I wonder, is there a different, I'm kind of right at the border between millennial and Gen X. And those younger tend to be all about community, but struggle a lot more with institutions because of their inherent sense of hierarchy or too much structure or whatever. And I think there's something about an institution that at its best can figure out how to accommodate pluralism and like hold diversity in a way, and communities can as well. But there's something about an institution, because you're trying to think, I don't know, there's a little bit more of a realpolitik. You're thinking about the structures that enable people who are often quite different sort of work towards a common goal that is beyond themselves.
That's interesting. So an institute, you're saying an institution is almost by, if not by definition, at least by de facto, in practice, has to accommodate a pluralism that other affiliations may not be as good at?
Yeah, and I think that's okay. I mean, I've been thinking lately, a comment we've actually thought about commissioning an essay called Maslow's Hierarchy of Pluralism, I guess if I were to write that, where I would begin is just this instinct that it's okay, like that some of us have, at the smallest, most intimate level of our attachments, and those that are probably most deeply forming us day in, day out, most likely those are not very pluralistic communities, like your family, but then you go out and, I don't know if it's a psychologist who once said this, I don't know who said this, but I love this phrase, like, the best adventures always flourish or fly from a secure base. And there's something about, like, I think it's okay if I happen to be someone who's very pro-pluralism, and partly I just grew up very cross-culturally, and I sort of always saw difference as a enriching thing, even difference in belief. But I also think we all need sort of there's something to be said for exclusivity and moral coherence at the most intimate level that then enables you to get up into more sort of public institutions that, I'm thinking of one of the very few institutions left in our U.S. society that still has so much of the public's trust, and that's the military. Mm-hmm. And they're obviously a very interesting combination of, on the one hand, being very regimented, and there's a lot of moral coherence in terms of people's understanding of why they're there to serve. The rituals that are implemented to try to enforce a certain shared set of norms. Yeah. Those strict rituals, right? Yeah. But they have found a way to be, one of our most successful integrating institutions racially and cross religion and so on. And the military is very imperfect, but I think it's just interesting that we, as a society, it's one of the few institutions we would, at least by the polls, we still trust as a large one. And there's something about the way in which they've been able to enforce, like, kind of thick moral coherence with very, very hodgepodge membership.
It makes me think about when, now I can't remember where C.S. Lewis, probably in Mere Christianity, talks about the idea of a parish system of church where you just go to church with whoever is in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Whereas, we, especially in the States, are accustomed to the idea of going and driving a little distance to find the church that lines up with your.
It's funny you say that. I have a good friend who actually does a lot of studying. Most of his expertise is in failed states and failing states, like national sovereign states that are out. But now he's like sort of turning that expertise to the United States as we're like in this like dramatic time. And so he studies social fabric and how does that relate to a state's strength or country's strength or not, or society's strength. Anyways, he's also modern Orthodox Jewish, and he has been kind of exposed to conversations within the American Christian world the last few years around, some of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with this notion of the Benedict option, the sort of argument that people of faith should really thicken their spiritual formation practices and perhaps, withdraw from mainstream culture to sort of purify and strengthen themselves. And so anyways, he's sort of sympathetic to that argument as someone who lives in a deeply like Orthodox Jewish community, but often says, you Christians are so vague. Like whenever I ask for clarity of how you would actually live this out, you never have very good answer. And he said, why don't you just think about, like, it's very useful to us in the Jewish community or in the Orthodox Jewish community that we don't drive on the Sabbath. And that just means that our synagogue is right there within, 5 to 10 blocks. Yeah. And that very tangible, practical nudge of that sort of law, which then forces you all to go to the same place, often with probably people who have, are quite, well, in that community, probably less different than, say, I would find in my church, in my neighborhood. But, and then there's like a consistency of mutual commitment throughout the week because there's just that geographical proximity. Yeah. And anyways, I just to jump off what you said, I still think in some ways, whenever we talk about sort of social fabric and social architecture, which we may get into, like you have to think about the bounds of a local place and sort of surrendering yourself to that over and above any other sort of perfect set of ideals you might have, in a community's membership.
Yeah. So at Comment Magazine, y'all talk about the idea of renewing social architecture. Since you use that phrase, let's go in that direction. And when you speak of social architecture, you are obviously talking about things beyond the life of the mind, right? You're talking about the place we live, places and people, and yet, as a magazine, your currency is the life of the mind, right? I mean, any thoughts on what is the question here? How do you go beyond the life of the mind when all you've got is the life of the mind as an editor?
Right. No, it's a beautiful question. You're honestly hitting my core sort of tensions every day that I feel in myself, actually, especially this year when early on in this pandemic, there was just so much pain and suffering. And I was trying to figure out what is the role of words and cognition and the intellect in a magazine and trying to serve all of that meaningfully. So, and I don't know all the answers yet, but I've tried to do some things. So I think we can get into that. But so a couple things, just purely, and some people roll their eyes when they hear social architecture and think that's just like a very fancy, verbose phrase. I personally like it because I think it gets at, again, the sort of vital role of place. And when we talk about social architecture, which is really Mark Cardis's phrase, but Comment tries to live into that and contribute to it as a magazine. It's getting back to the institutions question, but we basically mean sort of the visible and invisible scaffolding that sort of shapes and holds our common life. And that's everything from actual architecture, like the power of buildings and spaces and proportions and cities and design, to the institutions and norms that they might perpetuate for good or ill, and the various spheres of civil society, law, family, religion, commerce, etc., education. To that, and the social piece is like referencing that all that we try to design, even in our policies, in our businesses, should always be attendant to what we would see as that most fundamental unit of reality, which is not an individual, but is actually a human relationship. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what we mean by it. And then
time out. Can you back up just 1 second? Yeah. The most basic unit of what is a relationship rather than
the most basic, I might be getting myself in tricky water here, but I would say the most basic unit of reality, or maybe just say unit of meaning or measurement. That's 3 different things, I guess, but is the relationship between. It's sort of like what lies between people. It's not so much necessarily the individual, and that's not to get rid of the individual, but that is to say the individual is defined always in relationship to someone else.
So is it fair to say that the relationship defines the individual more than the individuals define the relationship? I know you didn't have...
I'm not sure I would quite say that. I think it's probably an even dance. I think it's a mysterious dance there.
Sounds like we're about to start talking about the Trinity or something all of a sudden.
Yeah. Well, I do think that mystery is like embedded into our very nature, and I'm no theologian, so I would not explain it.
Yeah, right. But, we probably aren't going to sort out the Trinity right here.
No, I don't think so. But, and your question about, so how does this care for social architecture, our sort of desire to put some vocabulary around that? Because it's often an invisible space that doesn't fit into our normal, like even academic departments or the way think tanks design their programs. How does a magazine contribute to that. And I kind of wrestle with this every day. I do feel with Comment in particular, I inherited a publication that has figured out in both tone as well as the mosaic of we have kind of a variety of content. We don't just do sort of big think essays. We try to weave in photo essays and narrative and poetry. And more recently, we're trying to encourage people to get together in small groups of 6 to 10 with like a bookmark discussing the themes in that issue, not so much as a book club, but also how does it relate to their own community. And we put like a little recipe in there. We're just encouraging people to get around tables because we do think of a magazine, or I think of it at heart, as an aspirational community. I think so. It's partly like through tone. There's an element. Comment has always been a magazine that has really sought to, and I'm going to quote James Hunter here, but sought to encourage and equip our readers to be faithfully present wherever they are, to be as creative as possible in caring for their sphere of influence, whether that's virtual or physical, and basically like being a good neighbor. And we like to provide the context within which people can think about that. I think more broadly, I have been really wrestling this year, as I said, in part because of the pandemic, in part because of everything that's been unleashed post George Floyd. And, I have this like draft on my computer that hasn't gone very far, but the title is like, Church, where are you? Searching for the people of peace. And in that's frankly as accusatory as it is like genuinely wondering, because in this year where everything's virtual, and like I said, I think there's just so much hidden suffering, and there's a lot of fear in the air. There's a lot of people catastrophizing in this political year. What is the role of intellectuals and or an entity, namely a magazine, which by definition is sort of an elite organ of trying to shape public opinion? What is the role of that in the face of so much unemployment and people dying and so on? And I think, and I continue to struggle with this because I'm not sure right now that, say, and then again, I'm adding the faith layer here, but adding sort of theological reflection. I'm not sure every minute that what we need is like better ideas coming from the quote unquote church. Yeah. I think what we probably need more of is just many more people who are inspired and are also equipped and supported by others, sort of kindred spirits, who are embodying just a completely different way of life, like a way of thinking and acting and perceiving and living. And, I've been thinking a lot this year about that very famous verse, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and how way is actually before truth. And obviously they're interrelated. But I just think there's something about, it's interesting, your podcast is called The Habit. There's something in this notion of just the small little, all the little choices we make in a day that make up a life. And a lot of people have critiqued the sort of modern day American Christianity for doing a really poor job of sort of forming the moral habits of its parishioners, of its people. But I wonder sometimes if we got a little less up here and went a little bit like below the neck in terms of somehow fashioning norms and behaviors and postures, so that, the people of God and all of its diversity is like known distinctly for being characterized by grace and excellence and patience and courage, and name a bunch of virtues. And so I should just say that I'm trying to give you my major struggle this year, because I'm not always sure what the role of kind of an intellectual cultural artifact is. I'm trying to do with Comment is try to bring to life on the page, particularly our print publication, which is really our gem. I would say like our special thing. Each issue we sort of treat like it's a dinner party almost, and we have different. There's a heavy entree kind of essay. There's an appetite to whet your appetite. There's a little sherbet sort of palate cleanser. I really do think in those terms, and that's much in terms of content and how we think of the questions we're asking, as well as who. And one thing I've tried to do, and it's an ongoing adventure, but really trying to encourage what I call street saints or community shepherds. And these are weavers, people who often, they may serve homeless. They may be involved in incredible kind of racial reconciliation work in Detroit. They may be, have found like a really interesting model for helping those with developmental disabilities and neurological disorders. They may have discovered the power of attachment and love to help like rewire. So I'm very interested in doers and helping those doers gain some verbal self-confidence to write in our pages. So we're not only just pontificating from abstraction and on high. And how do you kind of build some sort of a friendship even through the pages of a magazine between amazingly erudite intellectuals who they can name what's going on, often very powerfully, which the power of naming is no small thing and can help people make decisions in their lives and in their organizations. But how do we get them to be paired with those who, may have gotten a C in English class back in the day, but are actually like really transforming the sphere of influence in their city and their town? And have some wisdom to share. How do we kind of bottle up their wisdom in a verbal or visual way that the top academics or public intellectuals would listen to and respect? So somehow that's sort of where I sit every day, is trying to bring doers and thinkers together.
Man, I love that idea of equipping people who aren't writers to tell their story
and find their voice. Yeah. I mean, I think, some people, when I first, and this was my first, I'd written for quite a few magazines, but I'd never led one before. And so I was just thinking of my own vision of what I would do with it. And about a year ago, and someone asked me, so is your magazine for readers or for writers?
Oh, wow. What a great question.
Really great question. And to be honest, obviously we would like to grow. We would like as many people who we think might enjoy us to know about us. So that we have to think from a business perspective. We do want to serve readers, and we want to give them like a meaningful palette within which to have discussions with their friends, with those they don't know. So I do think about readers and being creative there. But in terms of probably how I'm motivated every day and the most meaningful feedback we get, it is when, actually just the other day, our next issue, our fall issue, is on how do you navigate mass uncertainty like we've, experienced this year. And we're trying to find those who have kind of tried to be a little hopeful about it. Who can we learn from who have often experienced precarity in their lives, be they really poor or be they disabled or what can we learn from jazz and the arts about how to navigate uncertainty and anyway, so it's a broad ranging theme, but I did commission an essay to a woman who works with largely like refugee and undocumented immigrant kids in Houston. And she's like really has this like beautifully developed theology of play and the purpose of play, both in healing as well as helping families who have very little support. And I sort of know this about this organization, and it's kind of just embedded in their practices. They've never really articulated it. So I asked her to just try to articulate the theory behind why play is so important in helping these families adjust to American life. And she did, and it was quite, it's a more editorial work on our end to really work with that sort of person. But the wisdom is just trying to almost like get the wisdom to be born out of the egg of stuff that they just do on a daily basis.
Yeah, right.
And she just wrote me yesterday, like, thank you so much. This is the most like challenging assignment, but I like, it has just like catapulted my ability to both obviously tell our own organization's story, but also, I think it like concretizes in people. It sort of can take them to the next step in developing their practice, and also gives them conversation partners out there who may read them, who have something to add. So I think there's an element where I try to view the publication as not just ideas oriented. We really are sort of trying to, through content, spark a community that is appropriate to our writers, that they need to do their work as best as they can and to increase their capacity and so on. So
you're back to a relationship too.
I guess so. Yeah, it's a little meta. Yeah,
right. And so, and you haven't used the term affection or affections, but with a name like comment. It sounds like, it sounds like ideas and talk, but as you know, you also, the other vitally important thing that writing and stories do is they shape our affections, and they make us want different things.
That's right. Yeah.
And so, just from my experience with your magazine, I know that has been the case for me.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah.
Let's say I came for the ideas and I stayed for the affections.
That we were just having a conversation as a team the other day. What are we best at? Attracting, engaging, or delighting? Using, I think, more recent sort of marketing language. And without even like a blink, we all unanimously said we're best at delighting.
Yeah, right.
We were lucky we're there. We probably need to work on the other stuff, but. By
the way, you say delighting is marketing language. It's also St. Augustine language and Thomas Aquinas language.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, no, I think, you asked originally about worldview and why we don't quite think of ourselves that way. I love that you use the word affection and a little also, desires, like spraying towards our readers, like more things that they could possibly want, and maybe convict to reorder some desires and loves. Yes. But I often think, part of our goal when I think about our readers is to give them a unique palette just for understanding in a deeper way their own role, like trying to give them a sense of moral responsibility and civic responsibility, like their own role in our times across demography and sector. And to just basically say what you just did in a slightly different way, to sort of expand their minds and hearts, often in probably a mysterious way that's more just through the alchemy of the experience of reading it, to consider the breadth of possibilities that are inherent, in Thy Kingdom Come, which is very animating for us, which is sort of a earth-centric, but sort of enchanted earth. How do you think about playing a role in that, like, holy enchantment?
That's good stuff. I love it. But this bonus question, this is for free. And what's it like working with Canadians?
Oh, I love it.
Different from working with Americans? Is there anything different about the way that Canadians think about the world?
It has been the best gift to work with Canadians, especially the last couple of years. It's been a little bummer since COVID, not being able to fly up there. I think I'm their lone Yankee working in the organization.
Really?
Sure, they think I'm a little crazy, but they're very well. So there's Canada, and then there's Cardis, and my experience thus far has been, and also this is in the faith context. Last week, I happened to be part of an Amerocentric kind of what is the future of the church kind of conversation. It was a little bit more targeted specifically in kind of quote, evangelicalism, quote unquote, in sort of a political context. And I confess there were some really sharp people there and thoughtful, but I kind of left the call very depressed and also felt very small. And there was a lot of conversation about people feeling like they're losing their dominant place in our society and so on. And I think working with an organization that's faith-based in Canada, their entire existence they're in a much more secular country than the US. So they've always kind of had that like remnant, like humble, they're just not afraid of being countercultural, but not in a culture warrior sense. And then you add the Canadian kind of combination of, I would just say, common sense and in some ways humility, and maybe a little sometimes inferiority complex to be so next to such an enormous, mover and shaker, namely the US. But I've loved it. Every time I go up there, I just think they're in a much more, it's almost palpable in the air when you go to a pub. It's just they're in a healthier social state than we are. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Tell me, I have wondered what it would be like to be the editor-in-chief of a magazine like yours. You are exposed every day to this great writing, these big ideas. Tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it is a lot sometimes. I think I'm probably still learning my own rhythms of how. So there's multiple things going on. I think my primary role as editor-in-chief I guess I would put it like I'm trying to be a discerning host of a conversation. And with how do I fuel my ability to be quote unquote discerning? It's probably not so much getting bogged down in all of the incoming pitches we may get. We do get some amazing, incoming stuff. It's more like I read a lot of other peer magazines and just try to keep my ear to the ground of, I don't love this phrase, but like, thought leader, how are people framing the conversation? And it's just, there's an awareness piece of kind of what are the zeitgeist questions that's this year, and how could we feel like we're relevant to them, but sort of explore them in a very original and sort of from left field way. So there's just kind of the awareness piece. I've been surprised. I just said this to our managing editor the other day. I don't know if this is pride talking or my own, like I just have a clear vision with the print issue in particular. Like I get inspired to approach a particular theme and then just brainstorm from there. We probably reject like 90% of, maybe that's high, but the creative process for us is like brainstorming a theme and then figuring out the mosaic of people who can come at that from so many different angles. Mm-hmm. So we're fairly initiating as an editorial team in sort of driving the ship towards people who should be on it, less just sitting there in the ocean waiting for tons of writers to come at us.
I see. Yeah.
And I don't know if that's even just to quell the potential overwhelm, but there's an element where we want to be a magazine for writers. Like I said, we don't want to just have a very heavy editorial hand where we're just trying to fit people into our vision. But I think once we have sort of the foundational question, we're really ourselves so curious about trying to explore, we go out fishing instead of letting the fish come to us.
Yeah, interesting.
There are exceptions. I mean, sometimes there are amazing pieces that come in, but that we're like, wow, this is perfect for us. And we'd be so honored to publish it. But at least at this point, we're a little bit more self-directed.
Is that unusual for a magazine, or is that kind of the way?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, we do with the print issue again, our online content is a little bit more, still tries to be in tune with cultural questions, but is a little bit more random. It's not themed. Because each print issue still is loosely around, like my first issue was like love versus fear, and how is that playing out in individuals and relationships and society at large. I think our winter one was on sort of tribe and tribalism and dissecting that. And I think for magazines that have a theme, a loose theme, and like a canopy around the content, that is probably more normal. And some of it's also pace. Like we only really publish one new large essay a week online. And then, 15 to 18 pieces in a given issue. So that's at some level a slow pace, you could argue. So we have to be very choosy.
Yeah. Okay. All right. This is a penultimate question because I always have the same last question. I just want to hear about that. You used a verb I've never heard before that makes sense. Catastrophizing. Does that just mean making catastrophes where the catastrophe is not happening?
I think it's, I'm just sort of seeing it a lot, and I'm not on Twitter, but I sort of know what's happening on Twitter a little bit, a couple of degrees separated. It just, especially in regards to, in the US context, coming up to a presidential election, I'm hearing both within quarters of the faith world and all of its range, as well as far outside it. Media right now is obsessed with that election, and it's very consequential. And I think I'm hearing a lot of, I think catastrophizing, apocalyptic posture, where sort of people have this view that everything hinges on this one day. And, it's basically driven by a sense of fear on either side, left or right, that this is a moment that's like existential for our society. And if a choice that I don't think is the wise choice is going to be made, our society is going to die. So it's just like the drama of it. We're on the cliff's edge, sort of a feeling.
Well,
I'm glad you're in a position to counteract catastrophizing, right? To say
I
there's
hope so. It just doesn't seem very, it's not sustainable emotionally or psychically.
catastrophizing is not sustainable.
I don't think so. And it's not good for our relational, like how we approach and be open-minded towards one another. So yeah, I would love to try to inhabit a middle voice. And that doesn't mean necessarily always be moderate. And it doesn't mean be like grainy or without punch, but, and again, this is, I think, where faith can be helpful, but ours is not the first era to feel some earthquakes at its core. And I guess I believe life is long, world history is long, and we owe it to ourselves and to our fellow neighbors to become, put the ordinary virtues first and foremost. And usually those ordinary virtues are kind of small and just quotidian.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're in a position, by way of encouragement, to help people want some things they didn't know they wanted. And I think that's one of the great gifts that a writer can give to.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Yeah.
You didn't know you wanted this, but feel this. Try this out. So, all right. Well, the last question always in these conversations is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
I love that question. Well, for me, the first that come to mind, and for anyone familiar with my work, they won't be surprised by this, but I just am a big Dorothy Day lover. She is a hero of mine in every way, but her writing in particular, I've always just found like very textured. She gets down to like the smells of the chestnuts and how that relates to like urban poverty. And I love, there's a sort of almost a female holism to that. So she will always make me want to write. Christian Wyman, who I will never, ever approximate in gorgeous brilliance, but there's something about the way in which he captures the ephemeral, or ethereal, I should say, elements of sort of almost mystical elements of spirituality and faith. I can never quite explain what I just read of his to someone else, but when I'm reading it, I immediately feel like taken to a new dimension of clarity for the invisible qualities of our lives.
Also, he's good at describing things that are visible. He has a description of a dust devil that he experienced in West Texas when he was little, I thought. I've never seen a dust devil.
I know that passage. And you can tell he's a poet. Like he's got sort of that eye for the concrete too. From just because my sweet spot is a little bit more narrative nonfiction in my own writing. There's two, and they have to both be women, and they write for The Atlantic. Caitlin Flanagan, I just really respect her, and Amanda Ripley, who just she thinks about questions of like beauty in our politics, and she's both of their writing just inspires me to write. And then there's another guy who's actually written for Comment quite a bit. In fact, I think he used to be on staff, Doug Sikkema, he wrote a beautiful poem actually recently in this lovely, beautiful magazine that I hope you know of, Ecstasis. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that, Ecstasis magazine. It's basically a work of art of a journal. But anyways, I find Doug's writing like always makes me want to write. But I'm a bit of an odd creature in that I feel like I'm not a pure writer. Most writers could give you like 100 names. For me, it's like I'm very I'm more of a musical, I guess, in how I learn and how I think. So anything Ennio Morricone, if I just listen to him, or like there's actually a Nashville-based singer named Audrey Assad, who, if I ever need to feel like deep and courageous, and then as someone who really like increasingly is just so drawn to doers who are helping and transforming other people's lives. When I get to interview someone who's just in the trenches somewhere, I find like I immediately just want to start writing. So I think there's something about, yes, I love beautiful prose, but if I have any gift with words, which I don't always feel I do, it's usually inspired. It feels like the best way I could use that is to honor someone's praxis and their spirit. and trying to capture what they often can't themselves.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's when I see somebody doing what they're really good at, it makes me want to go do what I can do.
Yeah.
Or I think it sounds like your point may even have more to do with giving voice or telling other people about what good work these people are doing.
Yeah. Or trying to capture a way in which, a lot of these, I'm just talking to this woman who runs an organization in Atlanta called Jacob's Ladder, which works with kids with neurological disorders, and something about the way in which she understands their methodology and was trying to describe it, paired with her own sort of journey of faith and all of this very, very raw and difficult, relationships with families who are at their wits' end with their kids. I think there's a desire. I feel so changed by those conversations and expanded. And there's a desire to just try to capture what is the delta of how it's not about me, but somehow in the writing, I get to sort of name what has changed a little bit in my own living and posture as a result. Yeah. So
that's great. That's a great way to put it. All right, Ann Snyder, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio in the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to Jess Ray for letting us use her song Too Good as part of this podcast. Visit jessraymusic.com to hear more of her beautiful songs.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.